November 1956. The British Empire is technically winning a war. On the ground in Egypt, the paratroopers have seized the Suez Canal, they have tactical superiority, they have the French army by their side. But back in London, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is staring at a piece of paper that says the country is dying. In just 30 days, the Bank of England has lost $279 million in gold and reserves. It is the fastest financial bleed in British history. The Prime Minister Anthony Eden picks up the phone to call for help. He expects his closest ally to save the pound sterling. Instead, he gets a threat. The call wasn't from Moscow. It was from Washington. President Eisenhower had issued a silent ultimatum. Get out of Egypt, or we will bankrupt you by morning. This is not a story about a canal. This is the story of the precise moment the British Empire was murdered by its best friend. To understand why the British were willing to risk everything for a strip of water in the desert, you just have to follow the oil. In 1956, 2/3 of the oil used in Europe passed through the Suez Canal. It was the jugular vein of the British economy. Cut the canal, and British industry stops in weeks. But for Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the canal was a symbol of humiliation, a relic of colonial rule owned by British and French shareholders. Nasser didn't want a war. He wanted a dam, the Aswan High Dam, a mega project that would control the Nile floods and electrify Egypt. To build it, Nasser needed $200 million. At first, the United States and Britain promised to lend him the money. They wanted to buy his loyalty in the Cold War, but Nasser made a fatal mistake. He bought weapons from the Soviet bloc. Furious, the US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, decided to teach Nasser a lesson. On July 19th, he abruptly pulled the funding. He thought Nasser would beg for forgiveness. Instead, Nasser decided to take what was his. July 26th, 1956. Alexandria. Nasser stands before a crowd of thousands. He begins a furious speech about Western imperialism, but embedded in his speech was a secret signal, a code word that Egyptian military commanders were waiting for. He mentioned the name of the Frenchman who built the canal, de Lesseps. He said it again and again, de Lesseps. That was the trigger. While the West was listening to the speech, Egyptian commandos stormed the Suez Canal Company offices. They seized the files, secured the locks, and expelled the British managers. Nasser announced to the roaring crowd, "The canal is ours. We will use its profits to build a dam ourselves." London went into shock. This wasn't just theft, it was an act of economic strangulation. The British Prime Minister decided immediately Nasser had to go. But he couldn't just invade a sovereign nation without a reason. He needed an excuse. Britain needed a war, but they couldn't look like the aggressor. If they just attacked Egypt, the United Nations, and the United States would turn on them. So they decided to manufacture a war. October 22nd, 1956. A secret meeting takes place in a private villa in Sèvres, France. 3 powers gathered in the shadows. The French, who were fighting a war in Algeria and hated Nasser for supporting the rebels. The Israelis, who were terrified of Egypt's growing military power. And the British Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, who was there to make a deal with the devil. They devised a plan so cynical, historians still argue about it today. It was called the tripartite aggression. Here was the script they wrote. Step 1. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, looking like a standard border conflict. Step 2. Britain and France would issue a neutral ultimatum, ordering both sides to stop fighting and retreat 10 miles from the canal. When Nasser inevitably refused, because the ultimatum demanded he give up his own territory, Britain and France would invade, not as conquerors, but as peacekeepers sent to protect the canal from the chaos. It was the perfect lie. They would start the fire just so they could rush in to put it out. They signed a secret document, the Protocol of Sèvres. The British were so paranoid about being caught that Prime Minister Eden ordered the British copy of the treaty to be burned. He wanted no evidence, but he forgot one thing. David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister, kept his copy. He stuffed it into his pocket as insurance. 7 days later, the plan went live. Israel attacked, the British issued their fake ultimatum, Nasser refused. On October 31st, the RAF began bombing Egyptian airfields. The conspiracy was working perfectly. Militarily, it was a masterpiece. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They hadn't told President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was in the middle of an election campaign. He woke up to find his allies had started a war behind his back, just days before the American voters went to the polls. He felt betrayed, and an angry American president is a dangerous enemy. The military war was won, but the financial war was about to begin. By November 5th, the British and French military had secured key points along the canal. From a tactical perspective, the operation was a success. Nasser's air force was destroyed. The canal was within their grasp. But while the soldiers were winning in Suez, the bankers were dying in London. News of the invasion terrified the global markets. Investors believed this would lead to World War III. They began dumping the British pound en masse to buy the safety of the US dollar. The Bank of England was frantically spending its gold reserves to buy up its own currency, trying to prop up the value. They were burning through millions of dollars an hour. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a desperate calculation. Britain only had enough gold left to support the pound for a few more weeks. If the reserves hit zero, the currency would collapse. Britain wouldn't be able to import food or fuel. The island would starve. Macmillan tried to get an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. It should have been routine. But when he called the IMF, he found the phone line was dead. The United States had blocked the request. Under Eisenhower's orders, the US representative was told to veto any help for Britain until they withdrew from Egypt. Then, Eisenhower delivered the kill shot. The US Treasury held a massive amount of British sterling bonds, debt that Britain owed to America from World War II. Eisenhower sent a private message to London: "If you do not call a ceasefire immediately, we will sell all of it." It was a financial nuclear weapon. If the US dumped all that sterling onto an already panicked market, the pound wouldn't just drop, it would vanish. The British economy would be wiped out overnight. It was a brutal reality check. Britain still thought it was a superpower, but America held the mortgage. November 6th, just one day after the paratroopers landed, Prime Minister Eden surrendered, not to the Egyptians, but to the bankers. He picked up the phone and ordered a ceasefire. The invasion was over. The French were furious. They wanted to keep fighting, but without British support and American money, they couldn't continue. The Great had officially been removed from Great Britain. The political fallout was immediate. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, the man who tried to be Churchill, was broken. Citing ill health, a polite cover for stress and humiliation, he resigned just 2 months later. He was the last British Prime Minister to believe he could act without American permission. For the British public, the victory was a mirage. Because the Egyptians had sunk ships to block the canal during the fighting, the oil stopped flowing anyway. Britain had to introduce petrol rationing. The very thing they went to war to prevent, an energy crisis, was now a reality in every town in England. But the biggest casualty wasn't a politician. It was the pound sterling. Before 1956, the pound was still a rival to the dollar. After Suez, the world understood the truth. The pound was only safe if the Americans allowed it to be. Investors fled. The dollar became the undisputed king of global finance. The Suez Crisis taught the world a brutal lesson that stands to this day. You can have the strongest navy, you can have the bravest paratroopers, you can even have the moral high ground. But in the modern world, true sovereignty isn't about firepower, it's about solvency. The British Empire didn't end on a battlefield, it ended on a balance sheet, and the landlord had just collected the rent.